Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ian. I'm with SOFTRAX, and I'm happy to welcome you to our presentation this afternoon, the Internet of Things and its relationship with ASC 606. The Internet of Things is great, but as you probably know, it can have an explosive effect on your back office. So in a lot of ways, this presentation is pretty timely, and we're really excited to get into what I think is a pretty fascinating subject. So before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping things. This will be a CPE eligible webinar with your full participation. So in order to qualify for CPE credit, please do make sure that you answer the 3 polling questions that will be spread throughout the presentation this afternoon. Additionally, there will be a post-webinar survey for your feedback. That's always very useful as we continue to shape content in the future. If at any point you have any questions, any comments, any concerns, please, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature on your GoToWebinar console on the right side of your screen. I will try to save some time at the end to answer any questions that the audience submits. And if for some reason we run up against the time and we aren't able to answer all the questions, we'll be glad to follow up afterwards and make sure that all the questions do receive an answer. So I see a couple of people even join in as I was saying that. So one more just for the newcomers, this is a CPE eligible webinar. And if you would like CPE credit at the end, please do make sure to answer the 3 polling questions that we will spread throughout the presentation. And CPE certificates will be distributed after the webinar via email with no action required on your end. So with that, I'll be glad to dive in, and I'm happy to introduce our panel today. We're joined by Kyle Britto, Senior Manager over at CFGI. Kyle is a great partner of ours, and we've worked with him in the past. We're very excited he can come and join us again today. Kyle has 10 years of experience across a variety of technical areas, and specifically, he's an expert in the automation of revenue recognition and ASC 606. He has experience with several accounting systems, including our own SOFTRAX Revenue Manager software. And we're excited for Kyle to share his insight with us once again. And also from the SOFTRAX side, we are joined by Tom Zolli, our SVP and General Manager. SOFTRAX, if you don't know, we are a provider of advanced revenue management software for the automation of revenue recognition and complex billing, especially with regards to ASC 606. So Tom has a lot of insight to share sort of in this area as well. And I know that the Internet of Things is a topic that's very close to his heart that he finds very interesting as well. So a couple of quick words on our agenda. We'll start off just a primer. What is the Internet of Things, the IoT? How does it add to complexity, and how do we find it adding to complexity for many companies? And then what are the next steps? How do we operationalize a system to handle some of this complexity? How can we begin to take steps to rein in some of this complexity and overcome it? And then finally, how do we get started? So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Tom.
Okay, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Kyle, for joining us, and everybody that's listening in. Hopefully you'll find it to be an interesting topic. I certainly do. I think the Internet of Things is a very interesting space right now. So let's start off with just, what is the Internet of Things? And many people, I think, in these days are now getting very familiar with it, but it's really the concept of interconnecting physical objects. So in other words, equipping them with sensors, measurement devices, and enabling that data to be transmitted back to the end user. Some classic examples, even before IoT was IoT, I think Boeing did a great job. I mean, they instrument their planes, their engines to such a high level with these sensors that that information is for many years has been going back to Boeing, such that they know maintenance that's required on planes before they even land. It's a classic example. I think in the automotive space, another good example would be cars in general have sort of a mini internet in the sense of, a CAN bus where sensor data is all going through a bus and often being recorded in memory. It's often used for diagnosis when you go to get your car repaired. Tesla recently has taken it to a new level, so they're actually leveraging the actual internet to take all of that data that's stored. I mean, you hear a lot about the over-air updates from Tesla, but going the other way, there is video that comes back to them. There's, all kinds of information about how the car is performing that goes back to Tesla. And I would say that in general, consumers really like the Internet of Things because it allows them to be more connected with their devices. So a day-to-day consumer, I mean, something like a smart home, for example, where you can tell if something's turned on, lights are on, heat's on, what the temperature is in the place. All of those things. I think it just builds sort of a better connection between the consumer and the different appliances that they own effectively. Importantly, for businesses typically love the Internet of Things because it allows them to transition from a hard goods model where they're selling something and they're getting a one-time fee back for it, to now they can offer this data, and more importantly to them, they can offer some kind of a subscription model on top of it. So they're able to monetize the value add that they're providing via these, the ability to better connect with these remote devices. So it really, to me, it really is a win-win. And we'll speak on it more, obviously, in the specifics in terms of the impact of the back office. Unfortunately, as cool as it is, it does have a tremendous impact both to billing and revenue recognition. I think a lot of companies are starting to come to grips with that, particularly in the context of ASC 606. And that's what we intend to get into today. So with that, I think we can go to our first polling question.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate the introduction. The first polling question is very simply, where are you on the path towards implementing the Internet of Things? Have you considered it? Is your company trying to take advantage of this new paradigm? So I'll go ahead and launch the poll.
Yeah, and I'll say I'm very interested in this. I'm very interested to see the results of this survey. So the Internet of Things, going back to even 2012, I think we were talking about the Internet of Things internal to SOFTRAX, just in realizing that the level of complexity that it did drive then on the billing side. But in 2014, when the first ASC 606 specs came out, it was pretty clear on the revenue recognition side there was going to be some substantial complexity as well. So having said that, I think the adoption has been much slower than we expected. Just people moving to IoT. Here we are, 9 years later, and it seems like it's sort of still probably in its infancy, but it's picking up speed.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Tom, as well. I'm excited to see the results of this survey as well.
It looks like most of the results are in, so I'll go ahead and close in another couple of seconds and then share the results. So in the audience, if you're still thinking, I'd encourage you to go ahead and submit your votes. And here we have the results of the poll.
Yep, I mean, that on the path is interesting. So 5%, which would be probably similar to what we've seen in previous surveys. I think the 25% right above it is more interesting. So it sounds like more people are getting on the path than in past surveys, which is good, but still, fairly low number, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm also surprised at the first bucket there. First time hearing of it, I just feel like, to your point, like with Tesla being in the news, a lot of people have heard of it before. So, but I think it's heading in the right direction where we're starting to see that bucket kind of decrease. Sweet.
Yeah, I would agree. I think with Tesla, it's funny because people probably hear that but don't relate it necessarily to the Internet of Things, because I don't hear them using that terminology very often. But yeah, it is an example of it. So. Cool.
Awesome. Well, Tom, thank you for that background of IoT, and Ian, thank you for the introduction. So now that we have our baseline understanding of IoT, the question becomes, how does it interact with the new revenue standard, right, our ASC 606? And before we get too much into it, let's first talk about ASC 606 and what the new standard means. Then after that, I'll take you through two examples of a pre-IoT company and a post-IoT company, and the implications that drives for those customers there. So the new accounting standard sets up a 5-step model that codifies all previous revenue standards into one, thereby providing an ease of application, right? So our first step here is to identify the contract. Simply put, identify when a contract exists between you and your customer. Most times this occurs upon dual signature, but can be impacted by items such as termination clauses, payment terms, or contract combinations. And any one of those could either lengthen the contract or shorten the contract, depending upon what actually happens with your deals. Step 2 is to identify the performance obligations. So what are the promised goods and services you have agreed to transfer or provide to your customers, right? So like if you're a widget company and you're making widgets, right, that could be as simple as just selling a widget to a customer. And it sounds easy, but there are things that typically hamper this step, right? The biggest one I can think of is you have to prove that whatever you're selling or providing is distinct within the within the contract and capable of being distinct with readily available resources, right? So if we keep with this widget example, can the customer use the widget once it's provided? And most times the answer is going to be yes for that. Step 3 of the model is to determine the transaction price. And this is most likely the easiest step in the process, right? Many times this is going to be the contractual amount that you have stated in the contract. However, it does get a little bit tricky when you start to think about other things that might affect consideration, right? So if you're talking variable consideration, right? Do you have some type of volume rebates that you offer to the customer? Do you have some type of service level agreements to a customer? It's also impacted by our non-cash consideration, which you typically don't see that often. And similarly, it's impacted by what we call significant financing components or discounts, right? So if you have a 5-year deal with a customer and they pay for all 5 years up front, you have to start thinking about, am I providing them some type of financing? And the guidance is actually pretty specific about that, and also requires you to start thinking about interest and try to calculate that out of the transaction price. So it seems pretty straightforward, but there are some nuances to step 3. So now we've done all that, step 4 is where you go into allocating the transaction price. So now that you've determined the price in step 3, you need to allocate it to the individual goods or services you're providing that you identified in step 2. And this step starts with determining a standalone selling price, what we like to call SSP. And the SSP is determined based upon observable prices, as if you were to sell that good or service on a standalone basis, right? So if we continue with our widget example, if I sold one widget a couple times over, that helps me identify kind of what I believe that single standalone price is. Now it gets tricky when you never sell a product or service by itself, right? So in my software clients that I have, you typically see them provide software with maintenance, right? And you typically don't have one without the other. They're always bundled together. The guidance has thought about this, and it does give you 3 different alternative estimation approaches, right? So the most common one we see is expected cost plus margin. So what do you expect to incur for cost to deliver this product or service? And then you can add in a reasonable margin that you typically see on your deals. The next one is adjusted market approach. So what are your competitors selling for similar items, right? Granted, they're probably not selling the same thing that you are, but something similar and along those approaches. And the last one here is residual, right? So if you go through this process and you have your SSP for one item, you would find an expected cost for another, but then you have one item that's left that doesn't fit any of the buckets. You can use this approach where it's whatever's left in the contract that hasn't been allocated typically goes to this product or service. But it is very rare, and your auditors will tend to hone in on this part here to look for your support and try to justify why you didn't use any of the other methods here. The whole purpose of this step here, and the reason why it gets so complicated, right, is you're trying to ensure that any discounts you give to one of the products and services is allocated across the different performance obligations, right? What we're trying to discourage here is severely discounting one product to get another product from a customer. And step 5, our last step here is to recognize revenue as control is transferred, right? Control is a key item here, and it's kind of why the standard was established. And it's easy to do when it's a tangible product, but it gets more complicated when it's an intangible product, right? So with our widget, if I sell the widget, once I sell it to the customer and they take it, they now have control of it, right? So therefore control is transferred, and I'll recognize revenue at that point in time. But a careful part here is this can be impacted by things like consignment, right? So if I give my product to a third-party middleman and I have to wait for them to then sell it to an end user, I haven't transferred control yet, so I'll have to wait till that end user actually buys it. And with this step, you're either going to recognize revenue at a point in time, so the time you sell the widget, or over time. And a point in time is the default presumption unless you meet one of the 3 criteria to change it to recognizing over time, right? So the one is if the customer simultaneously receives and consumes the benefit. So think of like software or like Microsoft, for example, right? If you buy the license from Microsoft, you're using it while they're providing it to you. Or if you create or enhance an asset that the customer controls while you're doing that. And then the last one is if you're building a specialized asset that only the consumer can use, right? So if I'm building something custom for them and it has no value to anybody else, if they were to walk away, you typically would recognize that over time. Another one to think of is membership fees, right? So you're paying for a membership to like a gym or something. They're typically going to recognize that over time because you can access the gym 24/7 as long as your contract allows you to. So that's our basic understanding of 606, and I try to keep it high level and simple just because we can get into a lot of different pieces here. And with that, I'll turn over to our first example here. So keeping this one simple, we have a manufacturer who makes cameras, and they've entered into a contract with a customer to sell a camera, right? So if we go back to our steps, step 1, identifying the contract. It's a contract between the manufacturer and the customer to buy a camera for $150. So that's our contract. Step 2, determine the performance obligation. The only obligation that's identified in this contract is to sell the camera, since it's only one item we're selling here. Step 3, again, the simpler of the steps, determine the transaction price. The amount of the consideration, as identified in the contract, is $150. So that'll be our transaction price. Step 4, allocating out the transaction price. As there's only one performance obligation, the transaction price is the SSP, and there's no need for allocation. So that 150 will represent the value of just the camera. And then step 5, when do we recognize revenue? Right, so as we mentioned before, you can either recognize revenue at a point in time or over time, right? Control being the key here. So once we deliver the camera to the customer, we no longer have control over it, right? It belongs to the customer. So at that point, we'll recognize the entire $150 from the contract. And again, this is a simple example just to kind of bring home how 606 has impacted a lot of our customers. And with that, we'll move on to more of the subscription-based and the IoT example we put together here. So building upon our simple previous example, right? Let's assume a few years have gone by and the manufacturer has moved on to IoT, and to Tom's point, has found a way to generate revenue from the services it can provide. Now it's going to also provide support for the camera and an alarm system to go with the camera. The support that it's providing is provided 24/7, 365 days over the contract term. Also, the manufacturer has decided to start entering into longer deals. So in this case, a 3-year deal. So if we go back to our 5-step process again, step 1, identifying the contract. So in this example, we still have an agreement to provide a camera, but we're now also going to supply an alarm system and support for that camera. Additionally, we've modified the contract term to be 3 years, as opposed to just that one-time sale with a customer and that one touch point. And with that, the alarm system itself is being sold for $200, the camera for $150, and the support for $250, right? So now we have 3 different price points for these goods here. But all in all, the total consideration that's due to us is $500. So step 2 now, right, is to determine the performance obligations. So now that we're selling 3 different products, the support, the alarm system, and the cameras, those are going to be our 3 unique performance obligations. And for ease of sake here, we're going to assume that they're each can be sold by themselves and be used by the customer on their own. So step 3, determine the transaction price. As mentioned before, the alarm system is being sold for $150, the camera and the support altogether will be sold for consideration of $500. So step 3, our consideration is $500. And we'll get to splitting it out in the next step here. So step 4, to allocate out the transaction price. As there are 3 performance obligations, we'll have to look towards each of their SSP to figure out what the relative value is for each one. So if we look at previous sales of the alarm system alone, we can see that there's a pattern of selling it for $200, while the camera sells for $150, right? Like our simple examples told us. And the support typically sells for $250. So looking at the value of each of these guys, we can see that the support has a relative standalone price of 42%. The alarm system has a relative standalone price of 33%. And the camera has a SSP of 25%. And what we do is we take those percentages and then we apply it to our transaction price in step 3, right? So here in this example, we have a table here that shows the support. We'll carve out $210 for it. The alarm system will carve out $165, and the camera will carve out to $125. So different values in their SSP, but it's just because we're applying it to what we're owed for this contract. So step 5, let's figure out when we typically recognize revenue. And again, it's all based upon control. So once the alarm system and the camera are delivered to the customer, since they are tangible goods, we'll recognize our $290 from this contract, right? We'll recognize the cost of the camera and the alarm system, so yeah, $290 from the contract. However, now that we're providing the support that's 24/7, 365, we're gonna recognize that $210 over 3 years or $6 monthly. And this creates issues that we have to talk about now that include billing, invoicing, and milestone payments, and how we tackle that from a business operations standpoint. With this being the more complex example, some of the other items to consider is if the customer pays up front, like we mentioned before, we have to start thinking about our significant financing and whether or not we're providing some type of discount or benefit to the customer by paying earlier. And this typically arises when you receive cash for goods or services that you're going to deliver in the future over a year out. And as a result, the guidance will require you to calculate and record interest that gets allocated from the transaction price. Also, let's say you're going to offer staggered discounts or tiered pricing for the camera, right? So if you buy 5 cameras, you get 5% off. If you buy 10 cameras, you get 10% off. You're starting to fall into the variable consideration guidance, where you would need to estimate the likelihood that customer would get to 5 or 10 cameras and hit those discounts. And that also has to come back into transaction price. And you also have to keep track of it as you sell the cameras. Finally, if a customer wanted to modify anything in this agreement, you enter into the realm of contract modifications, and that itself has its own guidance. And it's very tricky for a lot of customers to get right. So the guidance tells you that if you enter a modification, the key item you have to ask yourself is, are you providing anything different from the original contract? The easiest answer to get to is yes, or what you want to get to is yes, because then you don't have a modification and you would treat that contract as a brand new standalone contract and not have to modify anything previously. Where it gets messy is if you say no, right? So in our example of support, right? If in year 2, the customer came to us and wanted to upgrade their support, we're not providing anything different, right? So the guidance tells you you'd have to look at what would be the impact to the contract if that support was provided day 1 of the contract. And in essence, you have to record a cumulative catch-up in the period the modification happens. And that gets tricky if you're recording your revenue or tracking your revenue on an Excel spreadsheet as opposed to a system, because you have to go back to the beginning of the contract, see what you recognize for revenue, determine what the new revenue pattern should have been, and then kind of calculate and come up with your adjustment for the period. And I know a lot of the auditors typically hone in on modifications just because there's a lot of judgment in there, as open to a lot of subjectivity. So that's more of our complex example here. So we can move on to the next slide. So now that we've looked at our simple example and our more complex example with the different products and modifications, right? Kind of what's next, right? The scope of IoT is vast, right? And ASC 606 is not new. It's been around for a few years. What's different now is now that it's been around, we've kind of proven it out, right? The big 4 firms have guidance, examples, templates. They've gone through audits at this point. There's SEC comments on 606. So we have a path forward for anybody who's going to adopt 606, right? The issue now is operationalization. Like, for example, currently I have a client who's implementing 606. We're helping them with that process. We've got the adoption specifics completed. We've done the memo. We've talked to the auditors about it. They're okay with it. The question is how do we go live with these changes, right? What happens on day 2, and how do we keep this process going? Adjusting historical numbers is pretty straightforward, right? That's easy to look at and get the data. It's more day 2 and working through that. And the examples that we've walked through previously, the first one is easy to put into operations, right? We have one product, one customer, one rev rec pattern. But what happens when you have multiple clients, multiple agreements, discounts, tiered pricing? You have clients that have different start and end dates, different regions. This is kind of where the true work lies now. IoT is very exciting and can bring with it more volumes of activity and growth. But at the end of the day, it will also bring with it many of the same comforts and conflicts that you're already experiencing. So you have to be an active participant, ask questions, and get involved, because you're really the one that knows what you're going to need going forward. And the more proactive you can be, the more visibility you have with what's coming down. The other thing I see a lot is a lot of my clients will keep their 605 books running in Excel. We'll keep the 605 books running, and then Excel, they'll do kind of a data dump where they kind of track the 606 requirements and use Excel to convert the 605 numbers into 606 by posting some type of entry in there. And that's fine, but the problem you're going to have is you're going to have more issues with your audit. You're going to have more potential for numbers going in incorrectly. And then when you get to the modifications, you're going to have to figure out a way to calculate what that difference is and what that cumulative catch-up should be across the different areas here. But the good thing is there are solutions out there, and we'll get into this soon, that can help you track this from an IoT standpoint and help you track your billings and your milestones and contract modifications. So those are two examples and how IoT kind of cross-sects with ASC 606. And with that, we'll turn it to our next polling question.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it. The second polling question here is sort of a callback to a previous presentation that we've done, but if any of you in the audience were previously present, we described 3 levels of automation as far as revenue recognition goes. So, the first level of automation is, your processes in the back office are primarily manual. Maybe you're using spreadsheets, a lot of manual touches. Then the second level of automation would be, a solution in place partially automated, but there are still a lot of manual touches involved, a lot of human intervention in the process. Whereas level 3 would be fully automated. You're processing your contracts without human intervention. So I'll go ahead and pull this one up.
Yeah, it should be interesting. I think as the complexity goes up, so the 5% or so that are already well down the path of IoT, it makes it very hard to avoid human intervention, when dealing with the things that Kyle mentioned. I mean, so contract modifications, variable consideration, significant financing if you have it. So it will be interesting to see where this falls out.
Yeah, I agree with you, right? Those are kind of the ones that are kind of hard and tough to model, right? Because especially with the modifications, you just never know what you're changing, and you have to go back in time and look at, again, what you provided already, what you recognize for revenue already, and determine that cumulative catch up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just a couple of more seconds here. And I will close it and share the results.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we have a pretty clear winner this time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's good to see that it's a lower number on primarily manual, Excel based. But like we were just describing, it's an 80-20 rule in my opinion. You can get some automation in pretty quickly, but when it comes to truly being able to remove humans from the loop on a contract by contract basis, that's where it gets a little more tricky. So you still have that presence, but if you can get that extra 20%, I think there's a major benefit to be gained. Just in terms of no longer, we'll talk about it later, but no longer having to scale, human resource, with your volume, if you will.
Yeah, agreed. And this is, I'm not surprised by this one either, right? This is what I typically see with all my clients and the work that we're doing. So
great. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. So in the next half of the webinar, we're going to talk a little bit more about operationalizing IoT, and it's a tricky situation for a couple of reasons. One, the post implementation of IoT, once you've added that offering, the rev rec does get pretty complex for the reasons we've mentioned. Two, it's an interesting situation where a company that's formerly sold hard goods, especially if they're just selling a single hard good, on an order and a contract, and the rev rec actually could be transitioning, and the billing for that matter, could be transitioning from something, as Kyle described, quite simple. I sell it, I bill it when I sell it, I recognize it when I sell it, very, very straightforward. And the company's back office could be just completely built around that, to what becomes something very complex. Now I sell it, I do bill something up front, but there are other components that I'm billing at different rates and possibly with milestones over time, or I could be billing based on usage and things like that. And in terms of recognition, it's no longer one-time recognition. Not only is it, different patterns of recognition, maybe the hard good is still one time, but the subscription is, let's say, ratable over 12 months, and there could be other things that are milestones. But also you have to start following the allocation guidance, and standalone selling price determination is new, variable consideration is new, contract modifications are new. So it's a pretty big swing for a lot of companies to get to absorb all that. as far as the options, I mean, there's a third option that I didn't include on this slide intentionally, which is Excel. Obviously, Excel is an extremely versatile tool. In my opinion, it's not really an option for an IoT type scenario, or at least most IoT type scenarios. It's just there's just too much room for error and exploding Excel sheets, given the complexity that will be faced. If you pull that out of the picture, I mean, the two most common other options are, one, to do things the old way that they were done. So, IoT starts to bring some advanced concepts to hard good manufacturers, basically. But those concepts, while in former guidance 605, they did exist. Particularly in the software vertical is a great example. So the concept of allocating and having to maintain some level of fair value and all of that was there. And if you look back to the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, the platform providers really, it's difficult. It's difficult for ERP providers to keep up with this rate of complexity, and for the most part they haven't. There's some exceptions that are, they're effectively doing the best they can, but in the 90s and the 2000s, they would have some core application, but as soon as you, let's say, bought Oracle or bought SAP, the very next conversation would be an introduction to the services team. And there you would be able to, tell them what isn't handled by the platform, and they would work with you and build out customizations. The problem was those customizations would continue to grow over time, and it led to this concept of vendor and version lock-in. And so, as you increase the number of customizations, first of all, you have a significant issue because now you own it. I mean, in terms of tests and things like that, it's going to be done specific to your instance of Oracle or SAP. If you want to upgrade, you very quickly get into upgrade costs that can get near the cost of the implementation in the first place, because all that stuff has to be carried forward. Then there's a maintenance issue. And so what would happen is, in that option, and still happens today, is companies basically get left behind. There are many versions back on the software, maintaining their own test approach, etc. On the other hand, the approach was good in the sense that you would develop a relationship with the ERP provider. It was effectively one throat to choke. It was one database. Integration issues, I would say, minimize. What you'd end up with is integration issues with the customizations. I mean, usually a lot was done in the integration layer itself. So, that was the former option. The problem I have with that option these days is, one, I think anybody that went through those wars knows it for the most part, it did not work out well. Two, even in that option, things are getting so complex, and IoT is a good example that it pushes the limit of that option. So the amount of work you would have to do in terms of the stuff you have to write to support some of these things like VC, et cetera, gets extremely high. The alternative option that it seems to be very viable is this notion of ERP augmentation. So it would say, you've got an investment in your ERP system, possibly no need to rip it out, right? So some people are doing this anyway just because it's still on-prem and they want to get to the cloud. It makes perfect sense. But even if you do that, it's the idea that you keep the ERP, at least for AP, AR, GL, so you have the financial package, and then you look and see, where do you think the gaps are? And for different companies, it's going to be different things. I mean, obviously CPQ is a very popular bolt-on to ERPs. The whole spectrum of revenue management with complex billing models and RevRec, I mean, that's obviously the one that we play in. The good news is that you can go out for any functional area, you can go out and find not one, but usually many point solutions that address that particular area, and you can make a selection. And as your business changes, I mean, keep in mind, if you acquire a new division or you have a new product you're rolling out or whatever, there's nothing to say that you can't either pull out some point solution that you're using to augment your ERP, let's say for billing, and either add another one or put another one in. And that's one of the challenges that the platform vendors have, because to do the job right, I mean, if you look at the billing solutions that are available today from the point solution providers, there's 10, 15, 20 of them out there, and they all do very different things. They're all good at very different things. A platform provider arguably would have to support at least half a dozen different billing solutions to cover the gamut. It's very difficult for them. So if you take an augmentation approach, on the plus side, it should really be zero customization. I mean, there's enough providers out there, and they're focused in their areas. The functionality is deep. You really, I mean, it should be a zero customizations goal, and tremendous wins if you can maintain that, and I believe you can. It's highly unlikely, other than a significant business change, that you're going to need to replace the point solution just because the depth is there. And I would say the integration and data issues are still present, there's no question, but via middleware layers and various approaches to keep data in sync, those issues, I mean, they've been tackled for so long now, there's pretty robust solutions to those. On the downside, I mean, it's not a free lunch. I mean, you do have to deal with multiple vendors. There's still at least perceptions of data integration challenges, and mistakes can be made that lead to data or integration challenges. So there is some downside, but in particularly in complex areas, I think the way it nets out is if you're a manufacturing company and it's very simple to sell widgets, recognize the widget at time of sale, all of that, then it's probably a platform play. I think the first challenge to think about when you migrate to IoT is the world changes, and you end up getting into what's effectively an increasingly complex set of issues, both on the billing and the revenue recognition side, and certainly other areas of the back office. And there probably is the time to make the transition to an ERP augmentation strategy. So that lays out some of the options at the highest level. And if we go to the next slide, Ian. So this gives you a picture of the approach that we've been designing toward for quite a number of years. And in fact, we started out originally as a platform provider and migrated to this approach. And in the approach, like I was saying, you would keep your ERP system as a backbone, and then assess it for gaps. Like in IoT, I mean, we believe, and we work with CFGI, and in the sense that we believe there's a potential for a lot of gaps in revenue management just because of the increase in complexity. In our case, for SOFTRAX, we focus on order entry, subscription billing, milestone billing, and revenue recognition. And this webinar is primarily based on revenue recognition. And what's happening in that process is we're taking in, three forms of data typically. One is, what is the order data itself? What are the contracts that are getting executed? What is the total contract value, like Kyle described? The second form is, what is the billing data? And we have to do that because we have to manage contract asset and liability balances. So we have to understand not only the pace of recognition of revenue, but the state of the revenue. This is an important, I think, point to bring out as you're looking at evolving infrastructure, because the platforms, the ERP providers, most of those systems were built for a manufacturing base a number of years ago for former guidance, where there was really an intrinsic link between billing and revenue recognition. In fact, most of them are designed to trigger recognition of revenue off the billing event. With 606, you're really looking for a fundamental change, in that you're looking for separation of billing and revenue recognition. They should occur on their own schedules. I mean, yes, data has to flow between the two to understand the state of the revenue recognition, but under 606, certainly you could be recognizing revenue ahead of the billing event. You could be billing ahead of a recognition event. There could be large spans of time between those two things. So it's a fundamental shift that the platforms don't lend themselves well to, but an augmentation strategy would, sort of as you see in this picture. The third form of input data is just referred to as signals to recognize revenue. Some people call these fulfillment events. A classic example, and certainly a hardware vendor, a hard goods vendor pre-IoT could experience this, where I sell some hardware, but I can't really recognize the revenue until at least it's been shipped or possibly even delivered. And so to automate that process, to remove human intervention from that process, we as the revenue recognition engine have to be able to receive that event. Downstream, I think it's fairly simple. The revenue recognition engine itself is just generating some of your journal entries that are sent back to the general ledger. So it's a fairly simple integration point. So this is sort of the basic structure in terms of how a strategy could work. And when we're saying augment, you see a number of modules here. It depends on the capabilities of the platform. I mean, I've talked to companies that the platform does anywhere from almost everything to they need to add one piece of this puzzle to a lot of companies I talk to actually have this whole picture. They just evolved over time, and they literally made the ERP system their financial backbone, and they rely on point solutions around it to do the heavy lift. You can probably go to the next slide, Ian. So this is the tricky part, and this is where the 80-20 rule applies. And in some cases, I even call it like the 95-5 rule. So the problem, if you don't get ahead of the problem when you're transitioning to IoT, is that with complexity, you see a steeper slope on the curve that represents, as my business grows, as my volume goes up, maybe, my historical basis is that for every, 20% increase in my business, I have to hire another body, right? Well, the problem is now I'm adding IoT, so my revenue is going up maybe quicker and getting more stable through subscriptions, but it may not be realized. But now, as my business grows 20%, I have to add 3 bodies because it's that complex, something like that. So the problem is that the slope of the curve goes up with complexity, with IoT in this case, and the only way around it, particularly for a high volume business, is you really have to make this shift. And the shift is, if today you have to have, very good accountants, smart people that are knowledgeable about the business, looking at every contract and making decisions about how the rev rec should occur, how it should get set up, or the billing for that matter, then you are always going to have people in the loop, and you're always going to have at least some slope on that curve. To get that out, you have to accomplish the remaining 20% of the remaining 5%, for the most part, such that you've done a one-time specification of rules. So you get your smart people to basically, look at the system, get it set up, get the automation set up such that it can handle all of these corner cases, variable consideration, contract modifications, all the stuff Kyle was talking about. Then the benefit is tremendous, because once they're out, the system's running, right? So if you're processing one transaction or 100 million of them, it's just a question of, can I get it all processed by the system in the batch window? So, you may see more hardware cost, but again, multi-tenant cloud, it's pretty efficient in terms of increasing capacity. But your need to explode the human cost element of the equation is managed, much better managed, and your risk goes down. The risk of problems with human entry, data re-entry, all goes down. So that's the challenge. I mean, that is basically at least one of the challenges. You can go to the next slide, Ian. So in terms of case studies, I mean, it's interesting, and we should add this as a survey question. And we didn't spend a ton of detail on things like variable consideration or contract modifications. Kyle went through it a bit, but you should look into it. I mean, the problem with the guidance is that there are areas that are at first glance, for sure, and then even second or third glance, look like that it's very difficult to accomplish the decision making required without human intelligence in the loop. And so we thought we would put in some case studies here that offer the counterpoint to that, because we do believe it is possible to do these things. Not always easy, but possible. And so, as an example, we have a media client right now that is processing on the order of hundreds of thousands of transactions a day, and I actually think their peak batch gets up close to 1 million transactions in a single daily batch. and it's not simple. I mean, it's not maybe the full complexity of IoT, but they have recurring billing. They have all of the complications of allocations, including determination of standalone selling price. They do have contract modifications. It's not every transaction, but at that volume, even if it's, I think it's on the order of 5 to 10%, you're still talking 20, 30,000 contract modifications that have to be processed a night. And the reality of that situation is there is no option to have humans in the loop. I mean, it's just they would not have the bandwidth to get the job done. And so for them, I mean, they were forced to attack these issues and try to reach sort of highest level of automation. But it's a good beacon to show others that it is possible, even in a very complex environment. And interestingly, I will say that even very large companies on the order of 4 or 5 billion in revenue that have like high dollar transactions, low volume, it's interesting how difficult it is for them to believe the level of automation that's possible. Whereas if you walk into a shop where it's same amount of revenue, 4 or 5 billion, but it's high volume, low dollar transactions, there's a lot of belief it's probably being done. And I think part of it, and something to consider, is just the overall structure of the team. So, these high volume shops, they've had to add a lot of technologists to their, certainly to their IT, but even to their sort of financial team, if you will. And they just think about the problem a little bit differently. Another good example is a healthcare client we have. And I thought it was an interesting example. It is somewhat IoT. It is IoT related, really. But they were making the migration. I mean, they had a transactional business, sold hard goods. They had to, obviously adopt 606. They actually had acquired a significant division that had a subscription basis to it, which pushed them into sort of the more complex forms of billing simultaneous with the sometimes unexpected increasing complexity due to the recurring type billing models that tripped the RevRec team into all the complex areas around allocation and things like that. And it was a good example because I thought that this company in general, in terms of pace of absorption, so IoT-like complexities hit them somewhat out of the blue. I mean, planning for 606, but the acquisition somewhat out of the blue, and not a huge time span to get the shop changed, if you will, to get the back office changed for to manage the new complexity. They had to bring in new software, they had to bring in some new people, and obviously go through implementations and things like that. But this was nowhere near a multi-year project. It was done well within the context of a year. So the major point there is that if there's doubt, there shouldn't be, in terms of can I achieve total automation? Can I quickly adapt my business for IoT? Sometimes when you get into the details of it, it seems daunting, but it is doable. It's been done. It's doable. So, next slide, Ian.
Third polling question up.
Yeah.
Looks like final question: which consideration is most important to you in evolving your back office system for revenue recognition, especially with regards to the IoT, but just in general, I'd say which consideration is most important? I will go ahead and watch.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to compare this one to prior polls that we've done, because it might be a different answer for those that are focused on IoT. I would expect the first one would be the heavy hitter, but we'll see.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the first one might be the biggest one.
Yeah.
My clients, I typically see the third one, the short and close process, as a key driver too, to those guys.
Yeah, I would agree. I have certain clients that fourth one, these are very specific instances, but their audit costs are just off the charts, and for them it's all about that. but outside of those instances, the third one is probably tied with the first one.
So we have about 90% in. So if you're still thinking, please just go ahead and submit your response, and I will go ahead and close the poll. All right.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. That's very
Oh
interesting.
yeah.
The second one went out here, but
I'm surprised at the 0 for the close process as well.
yeah, true. I'm glad to see the second one. You know what this is? I think, Kyle, let me know if you agree, but I think that the pass that the auditors were giving regarding security and controls the last couple of years, not a pass, I mean, so some of the public companies are still pretty strict, but it was some leniency. I wonder if the leniency is over at this point.
Yeah, I think the same thing too. I think the other part too is some of the audit firms, the way they test revenue, right? I think it's a little bit less, it's easier to test if it's automated for their purposes than going through each individual contract. Oh, I can see that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're going to wrap up the webinar here, but hopefully you've seen some of the challenges that IoT brings to the back office, but also the great benefits to consumers and producers and benefits to the business really. And hopefully you've taken away a some of the specific areas that you might be challenged with, and B some of the options to deal with those areas. So part of the purpose of the webinar is to provide some foresight as these things could be coming down the road if you're contemplating IoT or you're getting into the process, and this is what you can do about it. So if you have questions related to the guidance itself, the rules of the guidance, whether or not you will or will not fall under some aspect, some complexity of 606, I would reach out to either Chad Mello or Kyle at CFGI. They've been great partners, very knowledgeable and very experienced in these issues. And if you're further in and it's more a question about like how do I operationalize for IoT and can I drive that high level of automation, then certainly feel free to reach out to me or info@softrax.com. We would love to speak to you. We have time for questions, Ian. I think we're getting pretty close to the hour here.
It looks like we got about 2 minutes. It may be better just to leave it for now, and we can just go ahead and follow up with the questions via email after the fact.
Sure, no problem.
Rather than getting into it. That being said, though, I mean, everyone who's attending, thank you very much for your time. There will be a brief survey at the very end. It'll just pop up right in the GoToWebinar console. So if you don't mind, please just take 2 minutes or less, 6 questions, and it really does help us to improve our offerings. And CPE certificates will be distributed, like I said, via email to all those who would like them. So thank you very much. Tom, Kyle, final thoughts?
No, just thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kyle, too, for
yeah. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Yep. Stay safe. Bye.